What's important to know here is there are scammers out there that'll buy by the container load, show up with a credit card. The credit card goes through. So the credit manager thinks everything's fine and they release the goods. And the next thing you know, a couple of weeks later, the bank has actually declined the transaction. So the vendor is left holding the bag. So it's something that can happen. It's something to be leery about, especially big transactions. So that all boils right back down to know who you're selling.
Hard Times in the Land of Plenty is a song I remember from the late 80s, and it was the first thing I thought of when we started discussing a podcast on fraud. Because during challenging economic times, fraud can become more prevalent, and there are a number of reasons for that. Number one, individuals and businesses facing financial difficulty can resort to fraud to alleviate financial burdens. Weakened internal controls as a result of cost cutting and reduced staff can open the door to fraudsters. Difficult financial times can also lead to increased investment scams targeting those looking for a quick financial recovery. And then, of course, there's always cybercrime. So in this edition of the Trade Securely podcast, my guests are from the receivables insurance industry, and they have both seen an increase in fraudulent claims in the last 2 years. My guests are Anna Betts, is it? Anna?
It's Bates, actually.
Bates?
Yes.
Okay, Anna Bates. Sorry, I should have asked.
It's complicated. Portuguese, it's complicated.
That's all right. I should have asked you that sooner. Senior Debt Services Manager, Special Risks Insurance and Trade Guarantees at EDC. And Michelle Davey is Principal Broker and President at Credit Assure. So thank you to both of you ladies for joining me on Trade Securely, because I know from our previous talks, this is going to be a really interesting podcast.
Well, thank you, Janet.
Thank you for having us, for sure.
Right. So I want listeners to understand the perspective that you are speaking from. So let's clarify. My understanding, Anna, is that you review claims on behalf of EDC. Is that correct?
You are correct. I am a claims officer, so I process the claims, yes.
Okay, so you see a lot of crazy things, and that's why you know about all this.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
for sure.
Okay, and Michelle, your clients come to you as a broker of receivables insurance, right? So it's the impact of fraud on their businesses that you're seeing, correct?
Exactly. And we get an awful lot of questions from people who are not insured yet that are interested in insuring. And so we have to demystify that portion as well.
Okay, fair enough. So I'd like to start with asking both of you a really quick overview of how you've seen an increase in fraud activity in the claims your clients are submitting. And I'm assuming that it's probably a COVID related thing, like prior to COVID, maybe not so much, and maybe now, but you can clarify that. And Anna, I'm going to start with you.
For sure. So I've been working in the claims department at EDC for, I think over 12 years now. My goodness, time flies. And we are definitely noticing an increase in the number of claim files submitted that contain elements of fraud. So in the past 2 years, we have seen probably 30 to 40 cases, whereas in the last 10 years, I don't really recall very many. They were very rare and one-off, very isolated type of events. So I can definitely say that fraud is becoming widespread, and this really is of concern.
Okay. And Michelle, what type of fraud activities are your receivables insurance clients seeing?
Well, there's a number of things, from things that would relate more to cyber. But we're seeing credit card type scams. We're seeing buyer scams where people are pretending to be someone they were not. So we're seeing a lot of that type of activity.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the questions. I want to ask you, Anna, why do you think fraud is increasing in the claims that EDC is assessing? You must have a variety of ideas. Let's hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the world is seeing more fraud, and fraud is really evolving. It makes use of lots of technological tools. And I think commercial transactions too are becoming like more electronic and digital. I mean, you just need to turn on the news and you're always hearing about large cases of hacking and ransomware attacks. projects, like Petro-Canada recently, Indigo, Hydro-Québec, they all come to mind. And I don't think EDC is definitely not immune to this, right? We operate in this global ecosystem, right? I also think the global pandemic created chaos and maybe financial hardship for many. And perhaps this motivates fraudsters maybe to profit from gaps like in government support programs, systems, etc. And the growth of e-commerce is just amazing, right? It's really accelerated in the last years, like banking, payments, all that stuff is exclusively digital and electronic now. There's so many new digital marketplace platforms. So I think these technological advancements are growing really, really quickly, that the security measures don't grow with them. And they're not keeping up in protecting the information systems, and sophisticated fraudsters are definitely taking advantage of this.
Okay, so what concerns you the most about the
Well,
fraud that you are seeing?
the fraud that I'm seeing in the 30 to 40 files, well, I want to say the sophistication of the fraud tactics, like it's very difficult to detect fraud and its impact on EDC, right? Like we have a public mandate to support exporters who have legitimate transactions. We certainly don't want to be supporting criminal activity and fraud. I mean, this is against our ESG principles, and we really put our ESG principles at the heart of everything we do. It's very important to us. But in recent years, I want to say that we have been taking measures, and we've been working very hard to put in place risk assessment tools to detect financial crimes, and not only in accounts receivable insurance, but many other of our businesses. In my daily work life as a claims officer at EDC, I'm mostly concerned for the policyholders, our exporters. For the most part, they are the innocent victims of fraud, and they come to EDC for help. However, in general, fraud is not a covered risk in our policies, even if it results in a loss involving an unpaid accounts receivable. So the EDC policy never intended to cover such scenarios where the loss is the result of fraud. And I don't think that private sector accounts receivable insurance covers this type of event either. I mean, I think there are other types of commercial insurance that would cover these scenarios, and Michelle would probably know more about that than me. Michelle, are there other types of insurance that would protect
Well,
against fraud?
I specialize in trade credit, so I'm not very well versed in all of the other insurance products, but I do believe a good cyber insurance policy can
Yeah,
certainly be
I've heard of that
beneficial.
for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And there may even be corporate crime insurance, maybe as part of other liability insurance. I've heard, but I'm not.
I'm under the impression that a crimes policy is to prevent fraud within the company.
Oh, I see.
But exactly, I'm not well versed, so unfortunately I can't speak to that. But yeah.
But right. So, but what I do know though is that it's very frustrating for the exporters for sure when they realize that our EDC insurance policy can't help them when they are the innocent victims of fraud. So it's very frustrating for me as a claims officer. I'm here to pay claims, and certainly very frustrating for our exporters.
Okay, so I want to ask Michelle a question here because Anna, you're talking about exporters. Michelle, are you seeing fraud activities for people who are doing business within Canada with clients in Canada?
Absolutely. We're seeing it on the export side as well, but we're seeing it in the domestic forum as well. And it's not just as of a couple of years ago. This has been going on and off. Yes, we were seeing less of it. We're seeing more of it now. But I've seen a scenario where a company selling to Ontario, there were 3 companies with a similar name, and they were all owned by the same people at the same address. So my policyholder was invoicing the wrong buyer. So unfortunately, initially the claims department had said, no, this is not covered, but we had protected the claim, and they went and sued. They won, they got a judgment in their favor, and then we went back to the insurer, and the insurer paid out. But you have 3 company names that are extremely similar, that are using all the same global name, and
Right.
it makes it hard for that policyholder to know who he's actually selling to.
And what were the companies actually all 3 of them real?
Yep, they were all 3 real.
Okay.
So, and in that case, it was a non-payment situation, and the buyer eventually had to pay. But he ended up having to pay the insurance company because the insurance company went after it now that they had a judgment.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Okay. So I would that actually be fraud?
hmm, it's funny because the whole thing stemmed around who were we invoicing?
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And
So that goes to something that every time I talk to you in a podcast, you always say, know your buyer. Right?
So important for sure.
yeah, know who
Yeah.
you're dealing with. Absolutely. That is so important. Um, you know, there's so many things that we're seeing these days, and I know Anna has a whole lot to say on this, but we
Yes.
yeah, you do. But there's trade shows that people go to and they come back with a handwritten order that they took at that show, and they're all excited, and so they're ready to ship, and but they think it's a
Right.
real company, and it's not
I
necessarily
know.
a real company.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So you really have to do your investigating, right?
Oh,
So
for sure.
yeah.
yeah.
So I want to ask you, Anna, what kind of fraud scenarios are you seeing, and what are your learnings that you can share with policyholders at this point in time?
Absolutely. There are predominantly three scenarios that we keep seeing over and over again. The first one is insurance fraud. This is where our policyholders are intentionally misrepresenting to benefit from a claim payment. The second type of fraud that's very common is business email compromise. And then we see a lot of corporate identity fraud. So all the claim files that we've seen with fraud elements all pertain to these three things.
Okay, so I want to just go back to what Michelle was just talking on. The first one, you said they're insurance fraud, where the policyholders are intentionally misrepresenting to benefit from a claim payment. So is it likely, Michelle, that when you tried to have a claim for that customer who had the invoice and the three different companies and was trying to bill one and whatever, is it maybe the insurance company or insurance provider was going, are you guys trying to pull a fast one on us? And they were kind of investigating to see if this was
Right.
insurance fraud?
No, in this case, it was not at all that. The policyholder was, a straight shooter and still is. And it's got nothing to do with that. It's really a matter of, well, if you're insuring, we'll go with cars. If you're insuring a Volvo and you're insuring a Corvette, they're two different cars. So, if they
Oh, yeah. Okay.
do, then who are they pursuing? So it's really along those lines. It has nothing to do with the ill will of the policyholder in this case.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So, Anna, let's go back to what you actually mean
I know.
by
I actually
insurance
mean,
fraud.
I mean policyholders who have ill will, unfortunately. So they're falsifying commercial documentation or misrepresenting details of a transaction to make it fit in the particular coverage, or just blatantly creating fictitious transactions. They can be in collusion with the buyer. The buyer could be fictitious. There are so many different permutations and scenarios, and it's really difficult to spot, obviously, but I think that we are getting better at it. The more cases that we see, we have learnings, right? So we've kind of created a system of red flags when we assess claims, and I won't describe them for you in case the fraudsters are actually listening. I don't want to give them any ideas. It's already hard to detect this stuff.
Yeah.
Suffice to say that, I think valid, objective commercial documentation is really key when it comes to getting claims paid. And now we ask for much more information just to feel comfortable with the transaction, just to make sure it's legitimate. For example, where did this document come from? Its provenance. Like if you send me a PDF, if a claim or an exporter sends me a PDF, I don't want to think, oh, did you make this up? Like, how did you get it? Show me that the buyer gave this to you. So more than ever now, I think exporters need to make sure that they have kept an adequate paper trail. And obviously it's not paper anymore, electronic trail, so to speak, when they claim to EDC. So fraud has necessarily increased the need, I think, for adequate documentation
Mm-hmm.
and documentation really that can be validated objectively, that I can confirm, yeah, this is authentic, this is real, this is original. And I think Michelle had an example of this, right? If you transact over the phone or you write orders on a paper napkins, unfortunately, like it'll be difficult for EDC to pay you a claim because there's no way of validating that the transaction is really legitimate. There's no paper trail.
Right. Okay. So, and I don't want to dig too deeply into this, but let's talk a little bit, very briefly about, what are the penalties and implications if you do try to pull this off and you get caught? Like, what can happen from
Well,
EDC's perspective to,
well, yeah,
uh,
at EDC, definitely you're not going to get your claim paid because we are not in the habit of, paying out
yeah,
fraudulent transactions.
yeah.
Also, we will most likely cancel your policy because we have zero tolerance for this kind of fraud and crime.
Mhm.
And another thing, we may even report the transaction to the appropriate authorities. So
Yeah.
there are a
Yeah.
host of actions that we can take. Like we take it very seriously. It's something that we don't condone for sure.
Okay.
Fraud is a criminal offense, Janet. So
Yeah.
Yes, I knew that, but I
Yeah,
just didn't know
it's
what
true.
the implications would be if you did try to pull it off, you got caught. I mean, does it actually get filed? So that people know it's a criminal offense. So, okay.
It could,
So, yeah,
potentially.
you could. Okay. So you spoke of business email compromise. Now, I have a pretty good idea of what you mean here, but what are the scenarios around this exactly?
I'm going to give you an example. So and it's always this same scenario that happens. So our exporters make a sale, and then at some point in the transaction, their client, so the buyer in this case, gets an email that the banking information has changed. So the client dutifully follows the instructions they've received, thinking it has come from the exporter, and then they send the money to the new bank account because they've received new banking information. But what has really transpired is that a third party has gained access to either the information system of the exporter or the client and became aware that a payment was going to be made and kind of intercepted it. So unfortunately, in general, like the buyer does not want to pay again or does not have the cash flow to pay again. And exporters unfortunately end up with an unpaid receivable, and a receivable that is not claimable because we do not know who is responsible for the loss. And the result again is a loss of like hacking or fraud. So it's just very frustrating. Here in these scenarios, the buyer has the will to pay, they want to pay our exporters, but they pay into a wrong bank account.
Okay.
So
So, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
they can both be the victims of fraud. Like it could be the exporter systems that have been hacked, can be the buyer's systems that are hacked. And it's very
yeah,
difficult. It's very complicated to determine whose system was hacked and where the fraud originated.
we're
Yeah.
hearing more and more about these things, actually,
Mhm.
Janet. And I've had a couple of clients call me and say, some that are EDC policies as well, and they're saying the president's email was hijacked, and we've paid out 7 figures. So can you help us get the Bank of Hong Kong out in China to stop the transaction? So
Yeah.
it's a very scary thought. Now, I do have some advice for people going through these types of things. Your cyber policy should be able to help you out with that. The insurer on that end, that's not our realm of things, but when I heard that, that was my first reaction. Speak to your cyber broker and get them to get you some contact information of the people that and unfortunately that didn't happen. So there are other companies out there that do take care of these things. And I had a conversation with a gentleman by the name of Kevin Vincent at Cybercatch a couple of weeks ago, and they take care of all of these types of things, including negotiating with ransomware thieves.
Oh, very interesting.
So there are possibilities out there. I'm not well versed in all types of insurance, but I can say that if you do have a cyber policy, there are immense resources, and I would go back to that.
Okay. So, from your perspective, Anna, what would be your advice to avoid a scenario like this?
I would say like make it a practice to never accept a change of banking instructions via email. So it's always best to call and confirm independently that the banking instructions have changed prior to acting on the email. And this should be something that all staff in a company are aware of, right? And I think our exporters should also notify their own clients that banking instruction changes like are first confirmed over the phone with an actual person. I've seen many exporters even write this on their invoices, and I think that's really smart. It's a smart thing to do, that they do not change banking instructions via email, only by telephone. So it's a good practice, one to put in place, and I think it would prevent this type of gloss for sure.
Okay. Michelle, you had mentioned to me that you have seen issues when a bill is paid with a credit card and you think, okay, you paid with a credit card, everything is okay here, but then it wasn't okay. What happened?
And again, these are people asking questions about credit insurance, and when people are selling on a credit card term, often it's a prepaid scenario, and prepaid is not open terms, so therefore it wouldn't necessarily qualify under credit insurance policy. What's important to know here is there are scammers out there that'll buy by the container load, show up with a credit card, the credit card goes through, so the credit manager thinks everything's fine, and they release the goods, and the next thing you know, couple of weeks later, the bank has actually declined the transaction, so the vendor is left holding the bag. Again,
Wow.
yeah,
Oh my
that's
goodness.
terribly scary. And it's, happened on a number of occasions. I've heard of it more than once, and through various companies. So it's something that can happen. It's something to be leery about, especially big transactions. So that all boils right back down to know who you're selling.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about corporate identity fraud, Anna. What's that?
Yes. Oh, and we're seeing more and more of this for sure. It's when an exporter's client, the buyer, impersonates a well-known and creditworthy corporate entity by spoofing websites and email addresses. And it's always the same thing that transpires every time. So the client, the exporter gets a new client. They're really excited for the sale. So communication is kept up with the exporter and all is going well until the goods are shipped. Then all of a sudden, it becomes impossible to contact the buyer. Phone numbers no longer work, email addresses bounce back. Out of frustration, the exporter contacts the company via a number they found on the corporate website, only to be told that the company has no record of the PO or the sale. So it's frustrating because the exporter genuinely believed that they were transacting with the corporate entity. And I can totally understand why. I've seen so many POs that look legitimate. Fraudsters can be very sophisticated and very convincing. You really need to be observant. And I've noticed now that there are certain red flags that I look out for when I assess a claim. And after about seeing a dozen of these cases, I'm pretty good at determining if you are dealing with the same entity that you think you're dealing with.
Okay. So let's talk about, you talked about corporate websites are generally on registered domains. So let's
That's
talk
true.
about what you're looking for in somebody's email there.
Yeah. So when I start looking at correspondence between our exporters in the process of assessing a claim, I look at email addresses. So if your contact person has an email address that is different from the corporate website, that most definitely is a red flag. So corporate websites are, and I'm not an IT expert, and but this is what I understand. So they're registered domains, right? So the corporate entity controls the use of the domain. Anyone that is associated with that website will have exactly, and I'm talking syntax-wise, letter-wise, the same format as the email will have the same format as a corporate website. So you have to be super observant. Take a look at this email. Does it match the corporate website of the entity that you think you're dealing with? And I want to warn the exporters that changes are so subtle. It's like one extra letter or a dash or an extra period or an extra dot dash US. Another thing that's not logical, and I see this really often, is that you're dealing with a contact with a generic email like I don't know, joe@gmail.com, and this is supposed to be an official representative of a company with a corporate website. No, that's not logical, and that's very unlikely. So for me, that's a red flag. I always start by checking the emails against the corporate website.
Okay, and what are you looking for on a purchase order?
You need to scrutinize it. I mean, I think fraudsters are really good at copying corporate logos from the website. So a corporate logo in itself is not really an indication of anything. But I try, but I do try to make sure that the corporate logo, sometimes they change the address and the phone numbers, right? Because you don't want to actually be reaching, the fraudsters don't want you to reach the real company. They want you to reach them, right? So make sure on the logo, the address is the same as a corporate entity. The phone numbers are the same, that the area code for the phone numbers are in the same country. Another thing I look for, like, where are the goods shipped to? Like, does it make sense for this company to direct you to ship it to a certain location? Like, for example, once I saw a PO, and the company was an American company with a strong website, like a chemical manufacturing company, and the shipment went to an affiliate in Ghana. But if you look at the corporate website, clearly a domestic kind of US company with absolutely no international presence whatsoever. So for me, that was the red flag. Like, why is it going to Ghana, right?
Right.
Another thing, and just, in general, just be observant. Like, one time I saw a PO that was signed by Marilyn Monroe and Thomas Jefferson, like their actual signatures that you can Google on the web. And the exporter hadn't noticed that. He hadn't taken the time to try to read who signed it. So definitely be observant, notice details when you get a PO.
Yeah. And what are some of your final thoughts about, what makes a transaction look odd to you?
Well, I always do a reality check, or does this make good sense, right? Like, think of what you're selling. Go to the corporate website of this new client that you have. Like, what do they do? Like, is it logical that they would buy your product? Like, does it fit within their business and yours? Like, I've seen crazy things, like maybe an auto mechanic in Italy buying Canadian lobsters, for example. Like, why would an auto mechanic want to buy lobsters, right? Or just crazy things like
That's
that.
a crazy party.
Yeah, they're having a huge
Yeah,
party, right?
exactly. Like, for example, if you're selling, I saw once a company that sells some kind of agricultural commodity dealing with like a robotic company. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like this, that would have tipped me off. Like, why do you want to buy an agricultural additive for food when you, I don't know, do robots? Strange.
Mhm.
So if anything seems suspicious, find a number on the corporate website and call to confirm the PO. Like, the accounts payable people are, usually you can get so much information over the phone. A quick phone call can prevent a loss, and it's just so simple, and maybe even a material one for a company, and a loss, unfortunately, that is not insured under your EDC policy. So I think at the end of the day, like, my advice is pretty simple. Like, make sure the transaction makes sense, and make sure that you know who you're dealing with. And Michelle, you've said this so many times, right? Especially if this is a new client for you. Like, a little due diligence and investigative work at the front of the transaction can really make a world of difference. And and I get it, our exporters want to sell. That is what they're good at. They want to sell. But is a sale really a sale if you don't get paid, right? If you get caught up in fraud? No, it's not worth it. It's much better to, scrutinize, exert due diligence at the start of the transaction to make sure that this doesn't become a loss for you.
Yeah. And Michelle, like you've talked about this many times in the past. This is what receivables insurance is all about. But if you've got an receivables insurance provider that you're working with, and you're bringing on a new client, they can go and investigate them. That's kind of what they do, right? They can find out if it makes sense that this company is actually legitimate and can pay their bills, right?
Absolutely. And that's a strength of having that credit insurer do that vetting for you. They're there to help. If it doesn't make sense, if you're not sure, I always tell my policyholders, give me a call. We'll look at it with the second set of eyes. I've even gone so far as to do a Google Maps and look right down at the picture of the building to see if it made sense.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I also Google addresses, and sometimes it's like a residential house in the middle of an urban neighborhood. Like, it's ridiculous.
Exactly.
Why would it? Yeah, or a storage unit somewhere. Like,
If
not
it's a
very logical,
startup,
right?
it might make sense of a startup, someone starting in their basement. I
Maybe. Yeah,
get that, but if it's not, then you might have something to worry about. And
absolutely.
so these are things that we can do to help. but also the insurer will investigate and they'll come back with the official address and all that stuff. So if it's not matching, there may be a problem.
Yeah.
So just like you said, Anna, contact the company.
Yeah, investigate, like,
You know,
why are you using this address when this address is, your official address
exactly.
as per, a credit report, for example,
Oh,
right?
we moved. Okay, companies
Okay.
moved all the
Yes.
time. It
Yes.
happened.
Yes.
But it's got to be verified.
Absolutely.
And then of course the credit investigation company that the insurer uses will investigate and come
Hmm.
back. So
Hmm.
within a very short period of time, normally we'll have the answer as to, are we actually shipping the right place? So if you're not sure, say something. Does this make sense? Because we're all in this chain. We're all here to help you. And we don't want to see you have a loss, so that's, we're here to help.
Yeah.
Bottom.
Okay. So we're almost out of time, ladies. So I want any final thoughts or any final tips that you guys can both provide us. So, Michelle, yeah, I think you might have just given us yours, right?
I repeat myself a lot, and that's okay. I don't mind. Know your client.
And
That's the best advice I can give you.
yeah, and that's such an important message, right? Be observant, question, scrutinize. Don't just, accept what you see in front of you. Make sure it makes sense. That's it. Make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, you cannot take it on faith at this point
No,
in time.
no,
Follow
unfortunately
your
not.
gut too. Sometimes,
Yeah, yeah.
gut feelings are worth a world of knowledge. It's amazing what a gut feeling can do.
Yeah. Ladies, you know what? This has been so fascinating to me. I really appreciate your time to talk about all of the scenarios that you're seeing out there. And we probably should do an update sometime in the future on this. But thanks so much for sharing your insights and your tips. And I really hope some of the information that you provided today raises some flags for our listeners and protects them in the coming weeks and months. So thank you.
Thank
You're
you,
so
Jen.
welcome. Thank you.
Anna Bates is Senior Debt Services Manager, Special Risks, Insurance and Trade Guarantees at EDC, and Michelle Davey is Principal Broker and President at Credit Assure. She's also a member of the Receivables Insurance Association of Canada. The Trade Securely podcast is brought to you by the Receivables Insurance Association of Canada, a member-supported organization of Canadians helping Canadian businesses grow. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and please share this podcast to help others protect and cover their assets. I'm Janet Eastman. Thanks for listening.